Hello people, it's Jonathan again, also known as PC Genie, just basically talking about swordsmanship. So on this particular topic, I'm going to be discussing sport fences, and basically the sort of advantages, disadvantages, and some general advice for them if they want to get into the historical European martial arts type of community, into things like historical sword fighting. So first off, right off the bat, I'm going to say that people who start from that kind of background, actually, despite the prejudices and things like that, are not too bad at fighting. And although there are certain rule sets and things which are actually restrictive and potentially harmful, in terms of overall, they have got a bit of a good grounding, would actually be better in a fight, from my experience, than, say, someone who's got no experience in fighting whatsoever, tabula rasa, clean slate. So in terms of the specifics, which I'll go over now, firstly, with the advantages, I've got them written down on a sheet here off the top of my head. The first thing that comes to mind is footwork, in terms of actually being able to do things like advance and retreat fairly quickly, and keeping a good sort of balance and structure, so you're not sort of falling over, which actually is quite helpful in things like close play, which you'd be surprised how often people can get that wrong in fighting, which I admit, hand on heart, I only too often can get wrong myself. People like sport fencers actually start with a good grounding in footwork. They know when to, and they can actually retract and advance pretty effectively. Now the second thing that I find is a pretty good advantage with them is an already existing knowledge in distance and timing. So with distance, of course, you've got a measure of yourself and your weapon, so in a certain range you'll be able to thrust or cut at your opponent, or perhaps you might be just out of range, need to lunge or something like that. And those sorts of things are surprisingly difficult for people to measure. And you'll be surprised how many times I've seen people who are tabula rasa and they try to fight and they're doing things like they swing their sword brilliantly, but because they're out of range they're just cutting the air, and they just basically go like that. Oh, I'm over here, by the way. Whereas someone who's in a fencing background, a sport fencing background, already has a reasonable idea of things like their distance and their measure of how far they can extend, which actually translates pretty easily into various other weapons without too much adjustment, actually, and they're already mentally getting a good picture of their measure. And on a similar note, similar with timing. So timing, of course, if you're going to do something like a cut, or a thrust, or any kind of movement or action in a fight, there's a sort of a tempo, as it's described, a sort of a time frame that you need to do that. Because with everything you're going to do, there's going to be a minimum amount of time you need to do that kind of action. So of course, when you're thinking of how dangerous or how rewarding a move is going to be, you need to consider how long you're going to need to perform that action. Because if you do something like a really wailing, sort of hit, then you know it's going to take so long that your opponent's going to be able to do about 5 or 6 different types of things in that time. Or a quick lunge, you might be able to think of quickly being able to get in there and out before person B does something else. And that's a really useful thing to have in all aspects of combat. And you see that across all of martial arts, there's going to be a minimum amount of time you need to do any sort of cuts, thrusts, or if you're actually in close play and you're grappling, how long you need to maybe do a punch, a kick, throwing someone and grappling them, doing a wrist lock, any of those things, obviously and logically, it's going to take a particular amount of time to do that. And if you already have a good idea of the timing of things and what your body can do in that time frame, is a really useful skill to have. Now in terms of things like the disadvantages, and the sorts of things that need improving to get into the HEMA community, one of the first things we've got is for passing steps. So of course, when you've got things like a rapier or foil or whatnot, and you're doing sport fencing, there's a lot of doing advancing and retreating, using what are called sort of more shuffle steps, which would be just, if you can see my feet here, I'll go back a bit, just basically extending out and then closing the feet together, and doing that almost like a sort of a crab walk, I suppose you could say, which is good for quickly shuffling in and out of distance without changing your position or anything like that, just basically quickly going in and out as you need to. But in HEMA, what you need to do a lot is actually passing footwork, which is very important. passing footwork, rather than just staying with the same, let's say in this case I'm starting here, left foot forward, right foot back, and just shuffling in. It's really important to know how to and when to do things like passing footwork. Let's say if I cut here, I go onto the other side, and now, I shuffle back here, I've got my right leg forward and my left leg back. And those sorts of things are really useful. Or again, you could maybe start in a position and then you're going to advance and do a passing step to get into distance or to do a kind of action. And although there are times when shuffle steps are useful, also there are times when passing steps are important instead. And you'll find different times to use each. If you only know shuffle steps, you're going to be at a disadvantage. Apart from that, heavier strikes, yes. So with sport fencing, there are a lot of quick actions, which I must say are pretty good to start with and are very useful. And you don't want to just wail on your opponent because you're going to telegraph, look, I'm coming from here, off we go. But at the same time, there are going to be sort of moderate and heavier types of strikes. You need to know how to get used to them. So rather than just a quick sort of turn or adjustment that you do against a quick attack, you might need to do something like a sloping defense, which is this, or this, which is the way you defend against something like a heavier strike. Or someone's thrust, you need to turn it out to the side rather than just do a quick adjustment, depending on what sort of strike the opponent's doing and what weapon they've got. And especially with things like two-handed weapons, even though they're going to be able to do them pretty quickly with the leverage they've got on their weapon, or something like a spear, naturally the type of strike they're going to do tends to be heavier and tends to need more sort of, well, the types of defences you'd use against heavier strikes. If you don't know those, again, you'll be at a disadvantage. So it's worth practicing those as well as just the quick defences and quick types of cuts. Apart from that, various forbidden moves and things. So of course, suffice it to say, if you do something like foil and épée, you'll be doing lots of things like thrusts and those sorts of extending strikes, whereas you really need to get to learn different cuts. Maybe starting from here to like iron door and going up into high guard, chop down, all of that sort of thing, which you really need to get to learn. And apart from that, in the same sort of forbidden moves, you'll find if you were restricted previously to certain areas like the torso, the head, in HEMA, apart from a couple of things like don't intentionally strike the groin or a couple of things like that, generally it's anything goes. So if you're going to strike something like the foot, the hand, or you're going to strike at the face or do any of those kinds of things, then then that's fine, as long as of course you're not using sharps or intentionally striking in the groin or things like that. So if you're not used to those, you need to get used to defending everywhere in the body and being able to attack everywhere in the body whenever you need to and whenever you find the opportunity. Apart from that, we've got close play as the final note, which is basically if we're all sort of fighting around doing cuts and thrusts and then suddenly someone closes the distance, now trying to do things like take the arm, wrestle the weapon out, thank you very much, or even they're getting so close they're actually doing, sort of throws, or they're doing things like, well, hip throws or grapples, disarms, takedowns, that sort of thing. And you really need to know how to do them in the first place and how to counter them as well. Because if you don't, again, you'll be at a disadvantage whenever you get into a close distance. As I say, as a final note, if you practice those kinds of things I mentioned, it'll make you much better as a sword fighter, ready to do HEMA. Okay? And have a good day, guys. See you next time.